Dr. Brian Plante, welcome to the Tick Bootcamp podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
We're really excited to have you, and we want to talk about all kinds of really cool things with you. We certainly want to focus on the brain and the impact that the brain is going to have on healing or not healing, and many other things that I think someone with your experience and qualifications brings uniquely to this podcast. So let's first begin by introducing you to the folks. Can you talk about where you're working and give us some insight into your educational background?
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Brian Plante, and I am a licensed naturopathic doctor in California. I am currently practicing at the Amen Clinic in Orange County. We have several locations across the country, and we see people all over the world. But I've been here since July 2022. Prior to that, I was working at a regenerative medicine clinic in Silicon Valley, and I did my residency in the Sacramento area, where I first got exposed to just how many Lyme patients there are that need support. We had people that were driving all the way from the Bay Area to get care from us, and there were very few Lyme docs in the Sacramento area.
So are you a native of California, or is that some place that you moved to after you completed your medical training?
So I grew up in Minnesota. And if any of you listening are from the Midwest or have spent any time in the Midwest, it's about a 6-month winter and hot, humid summers. So I came west as soon as I could to go to naturopathic medical school in Portland, Oregon. And I was so relieved to experience the green there, but the rain got to me. So instead of 6 months of winter, it was 6 months of wet and dark. And for those of you dealing with mold problems, that can only get you so far. So I applied to residency in only sunny places, Arizona and California. And so when I matched in California, I was excited. And it had no intention of necessarily being here this long. California is a very expensive place to live, but I feel very grateful that I get to be here because that weather really does help my health.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. So did you have any contact with ticks and tick diseases, either as a child growing up in Minnesota or as a student in your medical training?
So from a personal standpoint, fortunately not. I was deathly afraid of ticks, though, for some reason when I was a kid, and I learned about how there were some ticks that carried Lyme disease in Minnesota. Now looking back, I realize it was much more prevalent there than I knew when I was growing up. But I do wonder, to what extent did that fear foreshadow the work that I was inevitably going to do? But we did not get a lot of education on Lyme, even in naturopathic medical school, which was surprising to me and is surprising to a lot of folks. But I had the great privilege of training with a phenomenal ILADS naturopathic physician when I was in residency, Dr. Jaimy Kungle, and he taught me almost everything that I knew at that time about how to manage complex chronic illness, specifically tick-borne infections.
So was it your training with Dr. Kunkel that helped you to develop your passion for treating people with Lyme disease?
That plus my interest in complex pattern recognition and trying to get to the root of my own health problems. And so even though for me, at least to my knowledge, I don't have Lyme or other vector-borne infections, I got mono my second year of med school, and it just leveled me. My advisors were like, you should take a leave of absence. And I said, no, screw you guys, I'm going to do this. And I did do it. But what I didn't know is that there was mold exposure during that time. And so it took me a while to figure things out. I kept going to my acupuncturist, and they're feeling my pulse, and they're like, there's something toxic. It's probably your diet. I'm like, diet's great. It's not my diet. And nobody recognized that it was mold. And so I think there was this interest in, how do we use everything that we know as naturopathic doctors to solve complex problems that not a lot of people have answers to? And so it was that aptitude and trying to figure out my own health, and then seeing a huge need with the patient community in the greater Sacramento area. There's still a huge need in that region for Lyme literate physicians. And so when all those things come together, right, isn't there that Venn diagram that says your purpose or your vocation is what you're good at, what you're knowledgeable about and what you're excited about, and then what the world's need is. And it's like where all those things come together is where we're invited to step up
So all four circles came together, and it was treating Lyme patients.
Yes, and treating complex illness in general. But Lyme was sort of my introduction to that.
So talk to us about why you chose the naturopathic path rather than the allopathic path.
Yeah, so I often say tongue in cheek, it's kind of a joke, but also not, that I never planned to be a doctor. At least initially. It wasn't like I grew up as a kid thinking, oh, I can't wait to be a doctor. I really didn't know. And I was in organic chemistry class or AP chemistry class in high school and knew that I liked science and wanted to potentially go into medical research or something scientific related. And I was reading a book one day. I don't even remember the name of the book, and the author was saying that her brother was a healer. And there was something about that word that grabbed me. I was like, what is that? I was 18 years old. I'm like, what is the relationship between medicine and healing? And so I did a quick search on that and found at the top a page on naturopathic medicine. And it said, do you have the mind of a doctor and the heart of a healer? Do you want to be a teacher? Doctor comes from the Latin for having been taught or educated one. And so, and docere, the root for that word is to teach. And so there, this invitation for physicians to be educators, to treat to treat the whole person, to identify and treat the cause, to support and facilitate what we call the healing power of nature, which might sound a little out there, but it's the idea that health is the natural state of being when the conditions are right. And we don't have to make it happen. We just have to identify and remove things that get in the way of that. And that really grabbed me. So I went into undergrad full steam ahead, knowing I want to be a naturopathic doctor specifically. All of my courses were pre-med. I got a lot of pushback in suburban Minnesota about that. They're like, why do you want to do that? Why not go the allopathic route and then treat infections from, treat complex illness from that perspective. And now working with medical doctors in my current clinic and in my previous clinic, I see there's these common threads where we're starting to come together and think similarly about some of these things. So I'm profoundly grateful for my naturopathic education. And I would say I try to use the best of the knowledge from that field as well as from the wisdom of conventional medicine.
So after over 400 podcast episodes, one of the patterns that we've observed here is that most of our guests have had better experiences in having their chronic illnesses diagnosed and treated by naturopathic doctors than they are when being treated by allopathic doctors. Certainly allopathic doctors that do not have additional training in functional medicine. Can you give us some insight into why you think you folks may be doing a better job in treating chronic illnesses than traditionally trained allopathic doctors?
I love that question so much because my answer to that has evolved over the years and is still evolving. But the way I think about it is they are fundamentally different paradigms that we are educated under as providers. And so I don't always want to blame the individual physicians as much as the way that physicians are trained to think. So from an allopathic model, a disease is being caused by some kind of external agent, even if it's a process happening within the body, and it has a specific target of treatment. And so diagnosis A equals treatment B, and maybe you have multiple things, but they're addressed in different ways. That model falls apart really quickly when we start to see just how interrelated the systems in the body are and how affected they can be in chronic complex illness. We see that with long haul COVID. We see that with Lyme disease. We see that with myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia. These complex chronic disorders involve multiple organ systems in the body and require a treatment model that addresses that, as well as managing symptoms and supporting the underlying, what we call the terrain of the health of the body. And so from a naturopathic perspective, we are literally taught that from day one of school. We're taught to think about the body as an integrated system. We're taught to think about underlying causes. We're taught to think about how to not only manage symptoms, but really restore balance to the system, all the while learning traditional biochemistry and anatomy and physiology. And so it may not be quite as holistic of a model as traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine, but in terms of being equipped to support patients struggling with these multi-system illnesses, we have that paradigm, from the very beginning. Not to mention our diverse toolkit. So lifestyle interventions, nutritional counseling, a lot of conventionally trained physicians don't get any nutrition education, let alone stress management and counseling, homeopathy, botanical medicine, physical medicine like chiropractic work, which we also get in our education. And so being able to use those tools alongside the most powerful tools that conventional medicine has to offer, like procedures and pharmaceuticals, gives us such a varied toolkit, while organizing that under a whole person model of thinking about the patient.
Dr. Plante, can I jump in here? I just want to ask you a question because I completely agree with your philosophy, but we have a lot of people that are patients that come on this podcast and have concerns that when they use Western medicine, there are too many negative side effects, right? Broad spectrum antibiotics like doxycycline or steroids, for example. And I know those are probably more extreme examples, but they're concerned about the negative side effects outweighing the positive side effects. So how would you respond to that for people that are considering a doctor like yourself, but they're not sure if they should go full on Eastern medicine or more of a comprehensive approach on Western and Eastern medicine?
Yeah. So when I was in probably the first 3 years of my naturopathic education, I was very opposed to pharmaceutical medication. I thought this is relying on something outside of the body. This is not addressing the underlying cause. And then I needed a medication. Someone in my life recommended it to me. It took me a few months to really kind of get over my own mental hurdles to it. And then I tried it and it changed my life. It was profoundly helpful. It was like a lock and key, unlocking, or it was just the right thing. And so the way I think, I am not anti-pharmaceutical anymore. I prescribe a lot of pharmaceuticals, but I think the difference is how we use them. Are we using a pharmaceutical to do the heavy lifting when botanical medicine or lifestyle medicine is not being addressed? Or are we using a pharmaceutical to get us somewhere that we could not go without that external support? And sometimes we're also using the pharmaceuticals for a short period of time while we're getting those other pieces in place. I call it scaffolding. We're renovating the skyscraper of your health, but we need some scaffolding in place while we do that. I think about that a lot when it comes to psychiatric medications. We may not need that in the long run, but we do now. And so how we use it, when we use it, what our dose is when it comes to pharmaceuticals in general, becomes extremely important. And it is very possible to use them in a whole person way.
So let's now talk about the Amen Clinic and Dr. Daniel Amen, who I can tell you as an old guy, I remember watching him on PBS on many occasions and purchasing several of his books, best-selling author. So talk about why you decided that you were going to take your talents to the Amen Clinic.
Yes. So Dr. Amen and those of us that work for him are extremely passionate about advancing public education on how many mental health conditions, or what we label mental health conditions, are actually brain health conditions. And so anything that factors into brain health could potentially have psychiatric implications, neurodevelopmental implications, and neurodegenerative implications. We're finding a lot of relationship between environmental toxins and chronic infections with Alzheimer's and dementia. And some of our memory patients that we work with do the best because we're using whole person medicine with them, and we do it all at once, and people are feeling a lot of urgency because they want to preserve their brains, and so they do everything we tell them and they get better a lot faster. So when I heard there was a position, they were looking specifically for a naturopathic doctor in California to join the team, that was coming after about a 3-year period of working almost exclusively with complex chronic immune conditions. And Dr. Amen has said for years that the future of psychiatry is in brain imaging and understanding the brain as an organ. And I remember telling him during my interview with him, I said, if that's the next step for psychiatry, then the step beyond that is understanding the relationship between the brain and the immune system. So what I'm really excited about bringing to the Amen Clinic is that background with understanding those dynamics with autoimmune disease, chronic infections, and environmental illness to just how common and how under addressed these are in psychiatry. So that treatment-resistant depression may be a chronic infection. That ADHD that's really not improving despite medication, coaching, all of that other stuff, may be that mold that never got addressed in the home that you're still living in. And the list goes on and on. Hormone abnormalities that can be secondary to infections that can affect brain health. The relationship becomes clearer and clearer the more time I spend supporting patients with these issues.
Let's talk about brain health. And do you believe that your neural pathways and your brain health can make you more vulnerable to chronic illness, such as Lyme disease?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to be really careful how I talk about this, because a lot of Lyme and chronic illness patients have been gaslit by their medical providers. And a lot of those providers were speaking from a really unhelpful paradigm where the mind and the body are being perceived of as separate when they're not. And so we're not saying that the role that the brain has in our physiology is psychologizing these chronic illnesses. There are real, measurable, and experiential changes that happen in the body as a result of these infections, including in our brains. And so when inflammatory signaling molecules from the infections cross the blood-brain barrier, they trigger depression, anxiety, social withdrawal, executive dysfunction, brain fog. The presence of these organisms can rewire the brain. The limbic system, which is the part of the brain involved in safety versus threat detection and our ability to feel safe when connecting with other people, becomes activated and can rewire around that. And so you can actually have sort of a PTSD type response in terms of measurable changes in brain activity as a result of untreated chronic illness. And so that's one component. And the other part of it is, I believe this is Bruce Lipton, who said the most powerful pharmacy that we have in our bodies is in our head. And so to be able to use the brain as a tool to regulate our physiology can be incredibly healing as well. And that's the basis for some of these neuroplasticity programs that are out there, like Reorigin, DNRS, the Gupta program. I do a lot of work referring folks to trauma therapy. So things like EMDR and brain spotting and somatic experiencing. These are ways to rewire the brain in ways that have measurable changes on downstream physiology, meaning digestion, detox, immune function.
So why don't we define the central nervous system for folks? We have a full spectrum of people listening to the podcast. Some people who are new to the Lyme community, some people who are veterans. And I think it's important to begin with definition. So how would you define the central nervous system? What are the elements of the central nervous system?
The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord.
Okay. And do you also use the Andrew Huberman definition of the signals from the brain and the central nervous system to the body and the signals that come back?
I probably do, but refresh me how he describes that specific element of this.
So his argument is that the central nervous system is three parts. It's the brain, it's the spinal cord, and it's the connections to the body and the signals from the brain to the body and the signals back from the body to the brain.
Yeah, exactly. So another way of saying that would be that the brain and the spinal cord are the central hubs where this information is processed. But I think the temptation would be to separate that from the peripheral nervous system and all of our other, what we call end organs, like endocrine, hormone producing glands and things like that. So it is truly all connected.
So Dr. Huberman also argues that although it's an unbelievably complex system that controls everything from the first day that we're born into the last day that we live, he argues that what our brain does is it senses, perceives, thinks, feels, and acts. Would you agree with Dr. Huberman's description of the 5 elements of the central nervous system?
I would. Senses, perceives, thinks, feels, acts. Relates is a big component of that. I know we could say that factors into a few of those different categories, but I think that relationship piece, not just with other people and with nature and with our environments, but within the body, there's so much communication that happens. And I think that piece can easily be missed when we're studying, in conventional med school, biochemistry reactions or anatomy lab. Yeah.
Well, but isn't it the central nervous system that's going to determine, for example, whether or not your immune system is going to function or it's going to not function, whether every system is going to function or not function? Isn't it all driven by the brain?
I wouldn't say that it's all driven by the brain. There are bi-directional pathways. It goes in both directions. There are a variety of factors that go into immune system development, like the bone marrow and the thymus gland and the spleen, and they are not directly being governed by the brain. But I would say if you have a brain issue neurodevelopmentally, there are more likely to be immune dysfunction pieces. And we see that a lot. I work with a lot of autistic folks, and we see a lot of immune dysregulation there.
So the two more sets of definitions I want to go over with you before we sort of now move forward. Can you talk to us about the two expressions of the nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic expression of the nervous system, and why that's significant to a Lyme patient?
Yeah. So we were just talking about the central nervous system, but if we think about the peripheral nervous system, which is the nerves coming out of the brain and the spinal cord, one of the primary components of that is what we call the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system regulates automatic bodily functions that are involuntary, although we have some manipulation of them. And so among the autonomic nervous system, we've got our sympathetic branch and our parasympathetic branch. The sympathetic governs that fight or flight response. The parasympathetic is our rest and digest. Or if we really want to get granular, you could also say that a freeze response or a dissociation type response is a little bit parasympathetic as well, but in more of a maladaptive way. It tends to shut down digestion. It tends to disconnect us from our experience, although we may feel calm. So there's some nuance there, but most of the folks I work with are locked in the fight or flight response, and that can be exacerbated by the presence of infections. It can also be from a physiologic level. It can also be exacerbated by chronic illness as an experience, especially when you're like, I don't have doctors that understand this. I don't have support. My friends and family don't understand. I feel alone in this experience. That can further contribute to that activation as well. And there's a shift in our inflammatory environment, whether we're in sympathetic or in parasympathetic. I talk a lot about the vagus nerve. I'm happy to talk more about it if we'd like. When I'm dealing with patients, it's with that.
Yes, we would like to talk more about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, when we support the vagus nerve, it has an anti-inflammatory effect on physiology.
All right. One last definitional set, and then we can start moving forward with building on this. And can you share with us what neuroplasticity is, and how our brain goes from being a pretty I guess adaptive brain when we're first born, and how there are a tremendous number of neural connections that are developed during the first 25 years of our lives, and although we do have a neurally plastic brain, that it's a little bit different after we turn 25.
So neuroplasticity is such a fascinating concept, and the research going on in it over the last 20 years has really changed our understanding of how the brain works and how much capacity the brain has to adapt and change based on our environment and our thoughts and those kinds of things. And so the basic idea with neuroplasticity is that the brain can rewire, that they're not completely from the ground up, but there can be new nerve connections that form, new neural network patterns that develop, and old dysfunctional or maladaptive patterns of brain connections can be changed with the right types of interventions. And so when we're very young, a process that happens that's known as pruning, it is more, I find this concept fascinating. It is more adaptive for a system in nature, including our brains, to lay down more neural connections than it needs, and then to get rid of the ones that it doesn't need. That's more efficient for a system than to individually make the connections that it finds that it needs. And so the process of then getting rid of unnecessary connections is something called pruning. And that happens quite a bit when we're young, which is why, very young children, they, see things differently. If you just look in their eyes, they're perceiving the world in such an interconnected way because their brains are actually more connected. And then as we grow older, the pruning accelerates and there's less of that. And so what we are finding is that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain involved in planning, organizing, attention, and sequencing of tasks, now doesn't stop developing until we're around age 30. And that's with our current instrumentation, our ability to measure that. So we may actually find as our technology advances that on an even subtler level, there's still development of that part of the brain that's happening. That's why it's critically important that young folks don't abuse drugs or alcohol, because it can affect your prefrontal cortex from completing its development. But even over the course of the lifespan, there is the capacity to rewire the brain through practices, interventions, and other clinical strategies that promote neuroplasticity.
All right, Matt.
Let me okay, Rich, just for the record, Rich sent me a chat like 10 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago. Matt, why didn't you jump in? I've tried to jump in for the last 20 minutes and he just won't let me. So I just think it's funny because Rich Dr. Plante loves neuroplasticity, but I'm going to kind of not relate it to the patient experience, right? And ask you some questions for patients or people that are dealing with chronic Lyme at various stages to this podcast, and one who learn how it can help them. Because I see value here. And before I even ask you the question, let me just make sure I have a good understanding of what you're saying. Pruning occurs at a young age and lessens over time up until the time we're 30, but it might be later depending on the technology advancements of the future. And that's basically our body self-regulating neural pathways and basically retiring pathways that aren't serving us and then empowering pathways that are serving us. And as we get older, that doesn't happen automatically, and we have to be more aware and put more intent into making that process happen through neuroplasticity practices like Reorigin, for example, Dr. Plante. Is that accurate, or you can tell me I'm wrong? I'm not going to be hurt,
It is accurate. The only modification I would offer is that it's not just patterns that don't serve us, it's patterns that we don't use, networks we don't use, which is why, if you don't use it, you lose it, is so important when it comes to cognitive function as people age. And when we think about dementia and other neurodegenerative conditions, it's really important that people engage in new ways of learning and recruiting in novel activities in their lives, social connections, because if we don't use those pathways, there will still be some pruning or reduction in the robustness of those neural connections.
Yeah, and I want everybody to know we're going to get to more specific treatment options with you in a little bit, but I just want to kind of go down this path of neuroplasticity because we have people debate on this podcast and they feel very strongly about when is a good time during the healing journey to utilize neuroplasticity, whether it's DNRS, whether it's Gupta, whether it's Reorigin, whether it's My Vital Side, you name it, right? And I think for myself, a lot of my bad neural pathways, which were creating inflammation and making me more susceptible to Lyme, probably were part of the reason why I got so sick when I did. So I think it would have been helpful early on. But I also think that from getting so sick and then being bedbound, I had even more, worse neural pathways. And once I was able to physically feel better, I'd benefit even more greatly from neuroplasticity. So, I almost feel like it's good at all stages of the healing process, but people differ. So where do you fit into that little debate there, Dr. Plante?
Yeah, so this is where I think the Amen Clinic's model and the work that Dr. Amen has paved has really helped me think about this in a different way, which is if we think about the brain as an organ, then we think about answering that question as, well, how do we support the function and the health of the brain, the hardware and the software? So if rewiring the brain, rewiring these connections that are maladaptive into ones that are, more healthy, is updating the software. Is the computer or the car, depending on your analogy, overheating? Because if you do, it's not going to be very good at making those updates. So if I have somebody who is nutritionally deficient, or they're living in an ongoingly toxic environment, or they're in fight or flight because of their job or their relationship circumstances, and there's so much inflammation, but let's assume for this that they don't have mast cell activation, or that they don't have something that is severely limiting what medications or supplements they could tolerate, then the functional medicine or naturopathic medicine approach to really getting all those things addressed is going to allow the neuroplasticity exercises, whether that's a self-directed program or a therapeutic intervention like with a therapist. It's going to work much better. You're going to get results faster. You're going to have fewer side effects. You're not going to burn out as easily. Conversely, if someone has severe mast cell activation syndrome or multiple chemical sensitivity syndrome and they react to every product that you give them, you have to sort of start with what a person can do. So in those cases, I usually start with vagus nerve stimulation and a neuroplasticity program.
So Matt, let me ask Dr. Plant, what can you please define what a neural pathway is? Is it both a physiological and an electrical pathway, and why does our brain create neural pathways?
Yeah, so there are, I wish I had the exact statistic, but I want to say a few trillion brain cells, what we call neurons, or nerves. If I say those terms, I'm using them interchangeably, but they are connected in structural ways to other neurons, and those can make up structurally connected networks in the brain. And then there are functionally connected networks, meaning there may be regions in completely different parts of the brain that are not hardwired in with each other. You can't draw a line with multiple neurons in a row from one of those networks, for one of those regions to the other, but they light up at the same time, either with SPECT imaging or with functional MRI. And so those, we would say that they're functional neural networks. And it's really interesting because we're still learning so much as a medical community about just how relevant these are and what effects they have. But when we're talking about nerves that fire together and then wire together, it's that if there are structurally nearby nerve networks or nerve cells that become activated at the same time, it's more efficient for our brain to say, why don't we get a little bit closer to each other? We'll be able to transmit information a lot more quickly if we're connected, meaning the extenders of the nerve cell are then connected to the cell body of the next cell, so that electrical energy, what we call action potentials, are able to propagate much more easily. Think about it like back in antiquity, you're trying to walk, from one town to the next town, and you don't have a road. You might have to traverse over, a wilderness terrain or hills or things like that, versus building a highway, a super highway with 10 lanes on both sides.
So the brain creates these pathways because it speeds up the process and uses a lot less energy to communicate with different parts of the brain.
Efficiency is everything when it comes to the brain. And the brain, when it's doing this, is not thinking about whether or not this is good for us or not good for us. It's saying, what's the most efficient way to do what it is that we need to do in order to survive? Because our biology is wired for survival. So this gets into interesting territory when you think about chronic illness and survival physiology.
So we interviewed a neurologist a couple of weeks ago, and I posed a question to her that I'm going to pose to you. Do you believe that the bugs in our brain, meaning when Lyme bacteria and other microbes get into our brain, use our neuroplasticity against us?
I would like to do more research before definitively answering that question, but I do think about central nervous system infections where the organisms get into the brain versus systemic infections, but those pro-inflammatory cytokines, those immune signaling molecules, cross the blood-brain barrier. And in either case, you could have microglial activation, which is an activation of the immune cells in the brain. The problem with that is that can turn on pruning, but not in a good way, to where, we want to prune dead neurons and dying neurons. We don't want to prune live nerve cells because we don't regrow brain cells from nothing. We can form new nerve connections. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you expand upon that? Because I just found that fascinating. I don't know if I fully understood it. So are you saying that pathogens, so for example, Lyme bacteria in the brain, can activate these, I don't even remember the word you said, but basically the pruning process, and that can actually kill off brain cells that are good, essentially, is what I'm hearing. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So inside of our brain, there are a lot of different types of cells. But one of them is called microglia. And microglial cells are I guess you could say the resident macrophages, and macrophages are a type of immune cell that are a part of the innate immune system, and their job is to kick invaders out. And so those microglia, when they become activated, they start not just getting rid of dead and dying neurons, which would be their job, but they can start attacking healthy, viable neurons that we should be having until we die, or until they become, they reach their natural end. And so that can be hugely problematic. And so some of the cognitive dysfunction that we see, we wonder, I wonder how much of that is the immune system, you're just creating this sort of what we call sickness behaviors, where we withdraw to conserve energy resources, versus how much of this is actually a traumatic brain injury happening from the inside out because you have dying nerve cells, the same way you would if you had a concussion or something.
So let's talk about belief and what beliefs are, and how this process you just described could put us in a position where we do not believe we can heal from a disease, and how this could serve the microbes that are trying to prevent us from successfully healing.
Yeah. So one really fascinating process in the brain is that the limbic system, the amygdala and other structures that are in the kind of the central part of the brain that evolved to help us differentiate between safety versus threat and between self versus other. Think about it as like the mammalian brain. So like our mammal ancestors, it's how that there was bonding between, mother and children, and being able to sense our place in the world. That part of the brain is connected to the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex I mentioned earlier, planning, organizing, focusing. I think about the prefrontal cortex as kind of like the healthy version of a secure parent. So a secure parent that says, I've got you, we've got this under control, you don't need to worry about this, I'm going to lead the way. So under healthy conditions, the prefrontal cortex is going to be very active, and it's going to be telling the limbic system, the neurological inner child, in the analogy, you don't need to worry, I've got you. But what can happen is when the limbic system becomes overactivated because of psychological or emotional trauma, because of chronic infections, because of mold toxins, or anything else that might turn it on, there are nerve connections between that part of the brain and the frontal lobe that inhibit each other. So that means if the limbic system becomes overactive, it reduces blood flow and reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex. The opposite is also true. If we get our frontal lobe engaged when we're in a crisis moment, it will actually soothe that inner child and tell that limbic system, you don't need to worry, I've got it. I've got it from here. Thank you for sending alarm bells. We're now ready to deal with this problem. We've got it from here. So this becomes crucially important when it comes to belief and mindset, because if we can envision ourselves in a healthy future, in a healthy body, getting out of this, these are the things that I know that I can do to take care of myself, even though I'm having this experience, it keeps our frontal lobe engaged, or it helps get our frontal lobe back online, which becomes such a necessary part in putting out the fire of that limbic system tantrum, so to speak. And this isn't to demean any of these processes. I've had my own experience of limbic activation, and it's really, really hard to get your frontal lobe to be online when that other part of the brain is active. This is why when we see conflicts between people and between societies, that we're not thinking, we're not able to think, because we're just reacting from this fight or flight, this fear response, this survival response. And so finding strategies, both interventionally and with our own self-talk, to keep that frontal lobe engaged can make a world of difference in terms of how sabotaging that limbic system gets to be.
So quick question on that, because I want to circle back to how we do that, right? And some more specifics, but I don't want to lose sight of something you mentioned earlier about a functional MRI. And we hear this all the time in the Lyme community from other doctors, that MRIs are useless generally for Lyme patients, but functional MRIs are really powerful tools to help patients have a better understanding of what's going on in their brain and with their illness, right? So can you explain what a functional MRI is and how, and if you agree that it is a better tool for people in the chronic Lyme community?
Yeah, so I have less experience using functional MRI than I do with using SPECT. SPECT is what we use at Amen clinics. It's a CT scan. It's a little bit different, but both of them are measuring regional activity in the brain. So that means what parts of the brain are active, are overactive, are underactive, or are neutrally active relative to aged matched controls, as we would say. I would say with functional MRI, we get a little bit more definition in terms of the resolution and the distinction between, okay, this region versus the one that's right next to it, we can see in a little bit more clearly. But the jury is still out in the medical research on just how useful or not useful fMRI is in diagnosing a variety of conditions. And so I would not discourage, unless cost was a major issue, a Lyme patient from getting a functional MRI. There's no radiation with that. It's a magnetic test. There's a little bit of radiation with SPECT scanning, but if the information that we're getting is going to make major differences in our treatment selection, then we do recommend it.
Beyond the diagnosis of chronic Lyme, for example, I guess I was thinking, can it be helpful in identifying the parts of the brains that are activated to say, am I in that safe place activation mode, or am I in that, fight or flight mode? And can it be used as a tool by practitioners and patients to identify, how badly do I need neuroplasticity, and how badly is my brain activating the wrong parts that are causing me to have more chronic inflammation and perpetuating my illness, right?
My understanding, based on my experience, is yes, that it can. So can SPECT, and so can quantitative EEG, which is a measure of electrical activity in different parts of the brain. Those are all different sort of angles to observe the brain and measure different, activity, and that they can all be quite useful.
Are there other tests that you can use to determine whether or not somebody is in the sympathetic expression of the nervous system? For example, the HPA axis is of course, this also includes a hormonal process. Are there other tests you can use to determine whether or not we have this expression and the impact that this expression is having on your immune function, for example?
Yeah, so you could measure heart rate variability, which is a marker of parasympathetic or vagal tone, so to speak. And if that's really low, then somebody, may be sympathetically dominant, as we say, heart rate and blood pressure, simple things like that. I do a lot of saliva cortisol testing to assess the HPA axis. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Yes, it's a little bit different than the nervous system, but the neuroendocrine system, aka the nervous system and the hormone system, are so deeply connected that we will often see one serve as a proxy for the other. So I do a lot of all of that.
Can you talk to us about the impact that being in the sympathetic expression of your nervous system can have on the cortisol receptors, and how that could put you into a loop where you have this adrenaline shooting into your system on a regular basis and making it difficult for you to get out of the fight or flight expression of your nervous system without modulating your cortisol receptors?
Yes, so there's a couple of different components to that. There's the hypothalamus, which is in our brain. That's sort of like the master sensor, sort of one of the central hubs, as well as the initiator of the cascade of hormones involved in thyroid hormone production, in sex hormone production, and in adrenal hormone production, including cortisol, but as well as DHEA and adrenaline or epinephrine. And so what we often, and as well as the pituitary gland, which is coming out of that and is also a part of that network. And so what is interesting is that as cortisol levels tend to rise in the blood, the cortisol receptors in our hypothalamus start to become desensitized. Think about it kind of like insulin resistance, or like a boy who cried wolf situation. It's trying to tell the brain, hey, we're stressed, we need you to mobilize resources. And the hypothalamus is saying, you say that every day. What's different about this? And so one of the reasons why I love herbal adaptogens, as we call them, is that they actually resense. They don't necessarily lower or raise cortisol, although some of them do. But the true definition of an adaptogen is that it resets the sensitivity of those cortisol receptors in the hypothalamus so that they become more responsive to the signals from the body. And as a result, we don't overutilize resources that we don't have because the brain knows what it's spending energy doing and not doing. So does that answer that question? There's
Perfectly.
a lot of layers.
So it's sort of it's now bringing us to a place I think where where Matt and I wanted you to go, because one of the challenges that we have when we talk with folks about neural retraining, sort of as a prehabilitation tool, before they start to use some of these kill protocols, is that what we've heard from folks is that, I feel terrible. I can't put some time into a neural retraining protocol. Like they just don't think they have the mental and energetic resources to do it. Whereas there are people like Matt, and I'm sure he's going to talk to you about this. Matt was afraid to do just about anything until he started using some herbals to calm down his HPA axis, which then gave him the tools that he needed to go forward with some of the treatment. So can you give us some thoughts on the challenges with using some of these more rigorous neural retraining protocols before, when you're in the throes of the challenges with a chronic illness?
Yes. So going back to one of the first things that I said in our conversation, it's like we have to meet the patient where they are. And one of the first things that I said was using the wide array of tools that we have in naturopathic or in whole person medicine. And what I mean by that is, working with my patients to try to figure out, okay, what are they able to do? I had a patient about a week and a half ago say almost what you just said, Rich, word for word. I don't have the energy to do this right now. And I said, okay, well, we're vitamin D deficient. That's an easy supplement. I don't have a lot of people react negatively to that. We can, supplement. We can focus on minimizing our processed foods. We can focus on, some of the things that we can. And so what I do is I strategize with the patient what are going to be the most achievable first steps. And if that means you're going to watch 5 minutes of Reorigin, what I love about Reorigin compared to some of the other neuroplasticity programs is it is so user friendly and really takes into consideration the experience of the patient, which is, okay, there's 4 videos today, but they're only 3 to 5 minutes long. I can watch one of them. And I'll even tell people, don't even worry about remembering it. Just watch it, just so that those concepts wash over you. We can always go back. We can always do it again. But right now, I just want you to inch yourself in the direction, because I think when we look at the mountain and we see that first step is already being, 50 feet up, that creates a fear response in the amygdala, because then our brain's like, I don't think I have the resources to do that, which then sets off our physiology. And so any potential benefits would be canceled out by how stressful and overwhelming the demand is on the patient. So if there are things that I can do from a functional medicine perspective to enhance brain function or support cortisol regulation or calm the anxiety response with things like GABA, theanine. Do you want specifics?
Yes, please.
For this. So GABA, theanine, magnesium, lemon balm, there's a variety of other botanicals that can have a very calming effect on the nervous system. If people with fatigue take those and they find that they're really zonked out, then we may be thinking about, okay, is your cortisol low? Because if your cortisol's low, we may need to boost that. But we don't want to necessarily boost it so much that it triggers anxiety. So sometimes those are stimulating adaptogens like licorice, rhodiola, or eleuthero can make people more anxious. So there's some nuance there. I like the regulating adaptogens like holy basil and milky oat and ashwagandha, although some people are sensitive to ashwagandha. I would consider it a more balancing or nourishing adaptogen. And I love the nourishing adaptogens for people with anxiety and fatigue. They've helped me and they've helped a lot of other folks. And some of those could just be as simple as I'm going to get a tea. I'm going to get a $5, organic India Tulsi tea, which is holy basil, or I'm going to get traditional medicinals, which is readily available. It's like $6 at the store, things like that. But there is some trial and error because not everybody needs the exact same thing. Sometimes people may need more calming support and others may need more stimulating support. I can give somebody with chronic fatigue as a symptom NAD, and it may give them energy. And I could give it to another person, and it flares their mast cells, and they're super anxious. When I take NAD, I feel amazing, and then I can't sleep for like 3 days. So, sussing that out, being a little bit of a detective, is really what I love the most about doing this work.
Let me play back though real quick, right? Because I'll use myself. And there was a time where I felt I'm not in nervous system overdrive. I'm in a good state emotionally, brain-wise, and I was way wrong because I was so messed up. I didn't even know that I was messed up, right? And I think people need to know, like, how do I evaluate this? And you touched on things earlier, Dr. Plante, that I want to kind of speak to, right? When you are in this nervous system overdrive, you are in this severe state of fight or flight, certain things are going to happen that are signs that are pretty clear, tangible signs, I feel like, that you can share with our listeners to kind of have this unofficial proof that they're in nervous system overdrive. You mentioned, like, maybe they have digestive issues. They're not going to the bathroom a lot. Your body reprioritizes when you're in overdrive, right? So can you share with us some signs and clues that people can be on the lookout for to indicate to them, to validate their beliefs, or even just put it on their radar that they might be in nervous system overdrive, even if they don't think they are or believe that they are?
Yes. So our body gives us a variety of messages. And I would say, as a general trend in our society, we're not always encouraged, especially when we're young, to develop that awareness and that relationship, that feedback relationship. One of the things that I love about naturopathic philosophy is that we see symptoms as a messenger rather than a problem. They're messengers that there's some sort of imbalance in the system. So the way I would reframe that question for answering is, how do we begin to develop this communication relationship with our body so that we can hear the symptom messengers as pleas for help or signs that things are out of balance, rather than as problems to be eliminated or annoyances to be suppressed? That's not to say that they don't suck and that they're not annoying and that they could be really debilitating and really inconvenient when they happen, and they're still messengers. So if we haven't had a bowel movement in 3 or 4 days, something's not right. If we eat food and it just feels like it sits like a rock in our stomach, that's not right. There's something potentially out of balance there. And there's all sorts of things we could talk about in terms of how to support the gut. But a lack of digestive function, abdominal pain, lots of bloating. That was actually my first symptom when I got mono. Before I felt fatigue, before I felt sore throat, fever, any of that stuff, it was just like my gut blew up like a balloon. And it took years to work through that because I didn't know the things that I now know. And so something was off before I felt any of the other symptoms of the acute phase of the infection, which is that my digestion stopped working. And so digestion becomes a really big one. Sleep and anxiety can be another one. When people say, I don't even necessarily feel anxious in my mind, but my body is just kind of going into fight or flight. So what is that? Sweaty palms, racing heart, feeling like you can't sit still, feeling like you're jumping out of your own skin. That's fatigue is another one. So I've been doing a lot of travel the last couple of weeks. I've been doing a lot of new things, a lot of fun things, but I have not been taking enough time to rest. And I woke up yesterday and I was like, I feel like my Epstein-Barr virus might be a little bit active. And so I could go spend $100 testing, or I could just say, look, I'm going to need to rest this weekend. I'm going to need to take some more of the immune support, more adrenal support. I'm going to need to do less for a little while so that I can get back on track so this doesn't throw me off for a few months. And I'm able to do that in this stage of my healing journey because I've developed that relationship with listening to my body. Do I always listen and do the things that it asks? No, that's a growing edge, but I do hear it when it starts to try to get my attention. So those are some initial ways to start to develop that feedback awareness.
Love it.
Matt, why don't you share with folks how it was important for you to use some of the cortisol modulating herbs as part of your healing journey? Because one of the things that Dr. Plante, I think has been a blessing to me on this journey is I watched a really sick person, Matt, almost on a day-by-day basis get better as we were interviewing people and he was learning more and more about what folks were doing. And then of course I I've been a part of interviewing 420 folks who've given us, an outline of what their healing journeys were. So I saw it on the micro, and I've seen it on the macro, right? And one of the things that Matt would do when I was encouraging him to try something that one of our followers had recommended, he'd say, well, you're healthy, Rich. Why don't you try it first, and then I'll try it, right? And one of the first things we actually did together was we used the HPA balance from Dr. Rawls, right? And I tried it, and I can't tell you what a radical change it made in my life. I was in fight or flight chronically, and as a result of using that herbal protocol, I can't tell you the change that it made in me. And then Matt decided he would try that tool, which then calmed him down and allowed him to begin to take some other steps in his healing journey. So Matt, why don't you share that experience and what it was like for you?
Yeah, and I can honestly, this is going to sound very dramatic, but it's 100% truthful. I was 100% stuck in my healing journey. I was afraid of everything. Taking that HPA balance from Dr. Rawls and just happening to read an article and then attend a webinar of his about what it does, and just trying it because Rich did it, and I felt like, okay, let me give it a shot. That was the beginning of everything that I did to help me get better, right? I mean, I was at a state where I couldn't even walk a couple of houses without being in crippling pain for a week. And now I'm at a place where I'm running multiple miles and I'm doing well. And I wouldn't be where I am if it weren't for the adaptogens to help balance me out, to have a clear mind, to make rational decisions, honestly. So I think what I really want to ask Dr. Plante, though, is for me, it happened to be, the HPA balance by Dr. Rawls. And I think that works for a lot of people, but it may not work for everybody. So this is where, Dr. Plante, if you're comfortable, we want you to name drop brands, companies that you stand behind, because we don't really care at Tick Boot Camp. We want people to feel better, right? So what products exist from an adaptogen standpoint that can help people get past this part of the healing journey to balance their nervous system and start to make clear, sound decisions in the healing journey?
Yeah. So BrainMD is our affiliate supplement company that was started by Dr. Amen. And when I joined our team, I was proudly a snob when it comes to supplements. As a naturopathic doctor, I'm like, I know what I like. Okay, cool. We've got our own supplements. That's great. And then I tried them, and I'm like, oh, these are really spectacular products. The fish oil, the omega-3 power is really, really good. It's one of the most potent fish oils that I've seen. And so we have very similar formulas to the one that you just mentioned. We have one called Calm My Brain that has ashwagandha, and a few other things, a little bit of magnesium, a little bit of theanine, as well as one called Everyday Stress Relief, which is the same Relora magnolia extract that's in the Dr. Rawls product, but instead of ashwagandha, it uses holy basil. I think the Dr. Rawls one has, yes, sensoril ashwagandha, which is what's in our Calm My Brain. So we use holy basil as well as taurine and theanine in the Everyday Stress Relief. So that would be I would say, a calming or nourishing adaptogen formula. For folks that don't do well with formula, I also use a lot of cortisol manager by Integrative Therapeutics. That one has sensoril ashwagandha. It has Relora magnolia, as well as phosphatidylserine, and a few other things, I think theanine in it as well. That one I don't usually use with folks unless I've tested them first, and I do like a ZRT, salivary cortisol panel, and their nighttime cortisol is high. But for folks who don't do well with formulas and do better with single ingredients, I use Oregon's Wild Harvest brand ashwagandha, which is a little more calming than some of the other ashwagandha products out there that I've seen. I use Herb Farm's oat seed tincture. It's the milky oat top, which is more of the nervine, adrenal nourishing component of the plant. I use a lot of lemon balm from Herb Farm. They use a fresh lemon balm extract, so it has a little bit more of that lemony flavor to it, and it's a little more potent than some of the dried extracts out there. I use magnesium glycinate or a combination magnesium. There's a liposomal magnesium threonate that is from Live On Naturals, LIV-on. I like that one. There was a while where I wasn't tolerating magnesium personally. I don't know why, but I tolerated that one because it's liposomal. So you put it under the tongue and I would feel it within a couple of minutes, actually. So those are a few. I also use the phospholipids like Body Bio PC, which is phosphatidylcholine, which has a calming effect for a lot of people, as well as a cognitive enhancing effect. So for folks who are having brain fog and anxiety, the phospholipids like phosphatidylserine and phosphatidylcholine can be really supportive of that.
Yeah, and of course, I don't want to lose sight of the Reorigin program as well, right? Because you're giving us all these things. I feel like that are more early on, or maybe in parallel to some brain retraining stuff. Because I never would even consider a program like Reorigin until I had some of these adaptogens in me to, even process the thought of doing something like that, right? But now that we're kind of talking through all these herbs and supplements and tools to get us beyond that hurdle, I think the next thing we should talk about is the neuroplasticity. And we had Ben Aarons on. He was on episode 348, and he's the founder of Reorigin. And I know you've partnered with him now, Dr. Plante. And there's some other great programs out there as well. And even if people don't want to, are anxious about spending the money because they're on a tight budget, there's a ton of free YouTube videos out there as well on YouTube that can help people. And honestly, we have Lyme hacks, right? We have Lyme hacks. We have things on our website and our YouTube channel that are from the founders and from other programs that kind of give you tools in 1 minute or less on how to do these things. And for me, that was another tool that was so helpful. Deep breathing exercises, intentional thought, patterns, and just kind of repeating things to break those cycles. And that changes the way you look at the world, and it changes the way you feel. It releases tension in your body. And this is the part where I want to give a disclaimer, and I should have done this earlier, Dr. Plante, because a lot of people, and I get it, and I was there at one point, think that a lot of this talk is basically saying it's all in their head, right? That they're not really sick. And that's the last thing any of us believe. And I know you as well, Dr. Plante. There is a true bacteria, and probably a variety of bacteria, protozoa, viruses that are all reactivated and wreaking havoc in our bodies. But if we can't get our nervous system under control, we're allowing a hospitable place for these pathogens to flourish. So we have to take a twofold approach, which is working on eradicating the pathogens, but also helping our bodies restore our nervous system to a normal state. And that's the best way to recovery, in my opinion. So I don't want to lose sight of that. Can you speak to that too, Dr. Plante, before I continue on with the question?
100%. And my professional journey mirrors that almost to a T. So I spent my first 3 years primarily treating exclusively more from I guess you could say a bottom up approach, which is focused on the pathogen, focus on the toxins, focus on the micro elements of our physiology. And then the more recent time in my career, integrating in the top down control, which is what are the highest value therapeutic targets when it comes to recovery from chronic complex illness? And the brain is absolutely central there. It's the executor of all of these other things. And it is incredibly vulnerable to breaches of the blood-brain barrier caused by infections and toxins, the immune dysfunction that I mentioned that happens in the brain, which then affects the brain even further. And so we're not psychologizing this at all. We're saying the brain is an organ that is affected and can be infected by these things, but can also affect the way that the rest of our body responds. And so we can capitalize on that. We can do that by ways that help calm down the limbic system and activate the prefrontal cortex. We can do that by thought exercises. We can do that through body-based trauma processing, like I mentioned, EMDR and brain spotting and somatic experiencing. And what I like about Reorigin is it integrates both. It integrates sort of the cognitive behavioral therapy elements, as well as the sort of, calm the limbic system from a body-based perspective. So for those of you that saw my Lyme hackathon clip with, moving your head and moving your eyes, that's more of a body-based approach to calming the nervous system. You don't have to think. You could let your mind, wander while you're doing that exercise. It doesn't matter. It's going to have a bit of a calming effect. Now, that's going to work a lot better if you're also not having 10,000 automatic negative thoughts a minute. And if you start using tools to help reframe your mindset, that is going to be less of an uphill battle. You're also going to notice, as I did, that technique works a lot better if you're also seeing a therapist for trauma, if there's trauma. And we're not talking about the trauma. We're talking about actually processing that stuck emotional energy that keeps us locked in fight or flight.
What does that mean, processing it versus talking through it? I'm not really clear on that.
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked, and I'm continually trying to refine how I explain this. So you're going to get an answer that's in process. But essentially what happens with trauma or any kind of traumatic experience is we get hit with such an overwhelming intensity of an emotion, fear, overwhelm, grief, anger, And instead of that emotion being able to express itself, which is an embodied thing, we fight the person and we win. We get to, run away, from the threat, or we get to be comforted in our grief because our expressing of the grief brings people together. If that emotion doesn't get to fully express itself, that part of the brain, the limbic system, stays stuck in hypervigilance and says, we need to figure out a way to get that need met. But all of this is happening under the radar of our awareness. So we just know we don't feel right. We don't know what it is. And so what a body-based trauma therapy tool will do is it will microdose that intense emotion that you felt. So you can feel it, but tolerate it. And then you do it again, you feel it and you can tolerate it. And then it builds your capacity to then be able to feel that emotion to the point where it can go through its full arc.
How do you microdose it? How do you pull that out, right? Is that part of like a specialized therapy session?
Yeah, you wouldn't do this on your own. This really, because we need a witnessing perspective from another person who's facilitating the process as well. So, working with a licensed therapist who's EMDR certified. EMDR is a type of eye movement that when we're thinking about either the traumatic event or the belief or whatever it is, will start to bring up that activated feeling in our body, and you can actually feel it. And so we pull that emotion out through one of those strategies. We then use mindfulness that's facilitated by the therapist to then witness that emotion and not interrupt it, and then express it however it needs to be expressed. So sometimes people will cry, they'll shake, they'll get angry, they'll shout, they'll have an emotional response in their body. And then afterwards, especially a couple of days afterwards, the brain will start to rewire around that.
What are your thoughts on true microdosing, right? Using hallucinogenics or mushrooms or things like that to do this? Because there's been a lot of guests that come on and have talked about using, drugs and I shouldn't, drugs probably isn't a good word to describe it, but even things like ayahuasca, right? Or other modalities. I mean, so there's some like Campbell is another one, right? I mean, what are your thoughts on all those tools?
Yeah, so psychedelic tools are incredibly powerful tools, but they're tricky because one, there's a lot we don't know, but also there's a timing. There's a set and setting, there's a timing, there's a dose, there's all these other variables, such as if someone is dissociated or prone to dissociation, they're not aware of what's going on in their body. Using a high potency tool like that, particularly ketamine, which is a dissociative anesthetic, or DMT, may actually make things worse because what we need to do is actually be able to lean into and feel more of our body, but know that we're safe in it. Now, some people argue, well, psilocybin and MDMA do that. And I would say yes, and they have their place. But if someone has never done any of this type of work and they go have a heroic dose of a psychedelic therapy, it's going to be very, very difficult to integrate the intensity of that experience in meaningful ways. It may even set them back. And so I'm not to be clear, I'm not anti-psychedelic, but I advocate for a lot more caution than I'm currently hearing being talked about in terms of how we develop somatic intelligence, where psychedelic therapy, coaching and integration coaching on the other end, how that factors in, how we assess whether somebody's at a risk for having an adverse response, or whether this could be the therapeutic tool that really allows them to see how they're stuck. I mean, I hear stories about ayahuasca where people are like, I broke my addiction to all these other things because the spirit of the plant told me this. And so I think they can have their place. But the type of trauma processing that I'm talking about is less intense and therefore more manageable for most people.
I think we really have to be careful when we're talking about psychedelics, because we often hear in the community that there are people microdosing with psychedelics on their own. And I think there's a couple of things we have to say about that. The first thing is that most of the good research that's being done now suggests that microdosing is not helpful therapeutically. The second thing we should also encourage folks to keep in mind is that these are tools that, used with properly trained psychologists or properly trained traditional medicine professionals like shaman, could result in you having a positive result, but this is not something you should be doing on your own. You should be using these tools, if you're considering these tools, these heroic tools, in the context of working with well-trained, experienced professionals.
Yes, and historically they were not used on your own. There was community, there was ritual, there was ancestry relationships. I know I'm probably talking to a diverse worldview of audience in terms of spirituality, but there was all sorts of structure and container around it. And I hear people colloquially refer to set and setting all the time, but that doesn't mean being in a dark, cozy room listening to your favorite music. That means having somebody who is well versed in how to navigate the experience, which frankly is not most physicians or even most therapists. Shamans who have spent their lives developing relationships with these plants or these substances and supporting ritualized transformation, they're more equipped than anybody.
For sure.
But there needs to be cross-cultural dialogue here. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because so many folks that I talk to are using these things without that support. And it's not about saying, you need to have supervision or you're going to get in trouble, as much as it's like it could be unsafe for you, and it may make your neuroplasticity journey in a positive way more difficult, because a lot of these substances induce neuroplasticity, but neuroplasticity in and of itself is neutral. It's not good or bad. It's what we do with it. Andrew Huberman talks about that. It's about, if we're going to make our brain more malleable, are we then rewiring it in adaptive ways, or are we reinforcing maladaptive patterns that are just under the surface?
So can we talk a little bit more about this issue that you I really appreciate you giving us this sort of unwashed description of brain function, in real time with us, right? I really appreciate you being that vulnerable, because I think what we haven't developed enough, at least for me, is why we develop these pathways and why our brain, how it helps our brain to work more efficiently, and how these maladaptive pathways function. So, for example, I'd like to ask you an example of one of the folks that I've studied with. He gives an example of his name is David Baer. He gives an example of someone coming in contact with a dog for the first time, right? And if you're a child and you come in contact with a dog and your brain interprets that to be a threat, and you now have this neural pathway that's developed that dogs are a threat. Every time you come in contact with a dog, what's going to happen is you're going to have this automatic response, this shortcut that your brain's going to use to keep you safe in response to dogs. Whereas you could have another person who has another experience with the same dog, and now the dog is looking their face and it's something that's loving them up, and now they have a very different pathway that's developed. So can you talk about how we can have two very different pathways because of the way our brain is interpreting an experience, one traumatic, one not traumatic, and how that is going to be instructive in how we sort of reorganize our brain so that it can serve us rather than hurt us?
Yes. So I think keeping in mind that our brain, no matter the stage of development, whether we're very, very young, whether we're mid-childhood, teenager, adulthood, or so on, our brain's job is to take in information from our environment, including our internal experience, to make meaning out of that information, and then to predict what it needs to predict in order to keep us alive. It's like, what is the biological imperative? It's to survive long enough to reproduce. And so everything that goes, and that's not to speak about the absence of meaning and all those other things, but from a purely biological perspective, our brain is trying to keep us alive and trying to keep us safe.
So it's survival software, but it's also trying to keep us, it's also trying to give us the ability to respond without using a lot of energy, right? Because we have this brain that requires a lot of energy. So it's going to create all these shortcuts so that we can have a speedy response without using a ton of energy.
Yes, exactly. So how to keep us alive efficiently, in the most efficient way possible. Yep. And so as a result, our brain often will filter out extraneous detail, what it perceives to be extraneous details, to make predictable models that will conserve energy and keep us alive. And so this isn't a really, really important concept, I think, for people to realize, because we can be so hard on ourselves when we're like, oh, I've got all these maladaptive patterns and all these self-limiting beliefs, and like, what's wrong with me? Like, why can't I, get rid of these, get better? And it's like to turn toward yourself with an abundance of compassion and say thank you to those parts, those networks that developed. Thank you for keeping me alive. Thank you for keeping me safe. And let's do this differently from now on. Let's try to adapt the way that we do this so that protector in parts work or internal family systems, which is an approach to psychotherapy, we talk about unburdening the protectors. We start telling those protective parts in ourselves, thank you for keeping me alive, but you don't need to anymore. So yes, I'm happy to talk. I think there's not a whole lot I have to add to your initial explanation, Rich, because I think you did such a great job. But there are other factors as well. Like if someone's having a really emotionally overwhelming experience that has nothing to do with the dog at all, and then they come in contact with the dog, and the dog doesn't bite them or do anything, but because the brain is already preloaded to be in a fight or flight response, it can perceive that new information as being traumatizing or overwhelming.
So one of the things we talk about here at Tick Bootcamp is taking control of the narrative, or taking control of language. And I know it's traumatic for many folks in the community to be gaslit and told that it's all in your brain. But I would actually take the position that we should celebrate that we should take control of that term, because the truth is, I would argue that the central nervous system, and the brain in particular, is the most important organ. And it is all in our brain, and it is all happening in our brain. And why don't we just take control of that and say, the moronic doctor that was really gaslighting us happened to be right. And why don't we just celebrate that and agree that it really is the brain that we have to be focusing on in so many of the ways that you've just described for us as the foundation for getting to remission.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fortunate that information was given to a lot of people in a radically misattuned and compassionate way, and without practical tools. But yes, the brain is the most powerful pharmacy in our body, and we have control over it. Maybe not every element of it, but eventually, with the right knowledge, with the right support, and with the right tools, there's a lot that is possible. I mean, Dr. Amen's book, he's written many books, but his book, Change Your Brain, Change Your Life. One of the things I haven't talked about a lot, publicly, is how much in the last year and a half I've changed my brain through neurofeedback, through brain spotting, which is an approach to trauma therapy, through getting to know myself in a different way than I've done before. And it has allowed all of that functional and naturopathic medicine that I've been doing for years on myself to work so much better, and then kind of just get me through. But my life is changing. My relationships are deeper. My sense of self-compassion and ability to regulate my emotional state is profoundly different. My ability to experience things differently, and it's all changing because of my brain being different. And I've had a lot of help and a lot of support along the way, but it's also a lot of hard work. It's a lot of me showing up daily to make those decisions, to commit to what is good for my brain, because from that place, the rest of our health, organizes.
One of the things you said a little bit earlier is you talked about psychologicing. I don't want to use
psychologizing.
Psychologizing. Thank you. Psychologizing the experience. And one of my reaction to that when you had said that was, I think we should be psychologizing the experience because isn't really the psychological process just a part of the brain process? And when we're sort of segregating the psychological elements from the psychiatric elements, from really just the body functioning, that we're just doing that so that we have a way of understanding, we parse it so we can understand. But the truth is, it's just one body, it's just one brain, it's just a process. And we should be merging all of that and recognizing that when a doctor is, again, gaslighting us and not giving us the tools that come along with it, really what they're doing is observing the symptom that we should use as a vehicle for seeking the types of professionals like you that can help us to not only heal, but to have now the rich experiences that you're having now that you're learning how to rewire your brain.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, because there's so much nuance there. So before, when I was talking about psychologizing, I'm referring to this kind of Cartesian false mind-body split sort of thing. And we're saying the physiology isn't real. It's all a psychological process. And that's not what we're saying here. We are saying it is an integrated system, body, mind, spirit, environment. It's all one thing, but there are different tools with different language that can affect some of those processes more primarily. And then that has downstream effects on all those other things. So I mentioned internal family systems. I'm a huge psychology nerd. I love therapy. I thought about becoming a therapist. I incorporate psychotherapeutic tools in the work that I do personally and professionally. there's different language around that. Those are different angles in, but they affect my physiology and others' physiologies as much as it affects the mind and the emotions. The same is true of naturopathic and functional medicine. The window in is by affecting cellular physiology, but then our brain works better and our thoughts change, not on their own, but it becomes easier to shift them. Our emotional experience changes when you treat vitamin D deficiency that's causing depression. If someone is severely iron deficient and you give them iron, they will be able to think more clearly, which is going to be able to change what we do. And that's not even to say spiritual, community, relational, and environmental factors. Like if someone lives in an unsupportive home environment or a toxic job, let alone the biochemical environment of artificial chemicals or mold toxins, those things can affect as well. And so diversifying our language set so that we can talk about these tools in precise and targeted ways, while at the same time recognizing that they're all working together on one system that really isn't separated into these parts.
So we interviewed Dr. Leo Shea, and one of the things that we've done, and Matt's getting frustrated with me. I'm sorry. I just so much like I can't keep my.
I think we're going to ask the same question. That's why I'm laughing so hard.
You go ahead, Matt.
No, you go.
So one of the things that we've often quoted Dr. Shea as saying after we've interviewed him is that every psychological process has a physiological root. Do you agree with that, or would you part company with Dr. Shea?
I'm gonna have to think about that one because I don't know if I would say every. I think our brain, because it's our well, I guess like if we developed fine enough instrumentation to be able to measure, like, did you form a neural connection around that belief, that you had as a child, because at that stage of development, your brain was trying to make sense of that experience. And this was the most reasonable and most efficient explanation that the brain could come up with. And so now it has habituated that. You could say yes, but does that necessarily mean that, we only need to think about the brain from that perspective rather than calling into question all of those beliefs, which is a more psychological set of tools? I don't know. I'm kind of improving as I'm thinking through this, but
yeah.
I think, you could say that, but then we get into some philosophical and epistemological territory around consciousness, and is the brain the center of consciousness? And if so, why haven't we figured out where it is? Why haven't we figured out where consciousness is located in the brain, like the capacity to be aware of experience? And so I'm gonna have to chew on that one a little bit more.
All right. Go ahead, Matt.
It's a good one.
No, one of the questions I keep circling back to in my head is, we had Dr. Omar Morales on, and he was awesome, and another eyelids doctor. And one of the things he talked about was different types of neurological Lyme disease, from like an active infection versus a post-infectious state. And then also talking about why neurological Lyme disease from the actual pathogen creates anxiety and depression and all of these emotional and psychological conditions. So I'd love for you, Dr. Plante, to give us some technical geek facts as to why Lyme disease creates anxiety and depression. Because I can speak for myself. I never knew what true anxiety was until I got Lyme disease. Man, oh man, that was a weird experience, never having, anxiety like that and having, a panic attack, I believe what it was. So what is that, right? Why does all of a sudden you get sick with Lyme and you have these bugs in your brain and you get these crazy psychological things? What's at the root of that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different mechanisms. One is that these infections, some of these organisms can actually infect the vagus nerve and other autonomic nerves. And so that's more of a peripheral nervous system than a central nervous system component, but they're connected. And so if our vagus nerve, before I got really into all this stuff, I remember reading an article on LymeDisease.org that talked about this, that said post-viral fatigue and some of these other post-infectious chronic illnesses may be related to dysfunction of autonomic nerves from direct infection or direct injury from a toxin, for example. So that's one potential avenue. So if our parasympathetic nervous system isn't working properly, we're going to feel in fight or flight, and that may show up like a panic attack. The central nervous system piece, those pro-inflammatory cytokines, they cross the blood-brain barrier and activate parts in the hypothalamus that trigger what we refer to colloquially as sickness behaviors. So during an acute infection, like a cold or a flu, it would be adaptive for you to pull away from your family or your tribe and rest. That conserves resources for you. because you're sick. Your body needs to, use that energy to get rid of the infection. It would also preserve the health of your family and your tribe by pulling you away from them. And it may cause you to be anxious so that you seek out resources necessary to get better, for example. And so part of this is in our evolutionary biology, that sickness triggers these responses because they serve some sort of survival advantage for ourselves or for our immediate relatives. And then, of course, there's the infection. The infection can actually get into the nervous system, activate those immune cells even more. We can have an unintentional consequence that is not trying to keep us alive, like the one I just mentioned, but pruning of healthy neurons, dysfunction there. We also may have alterations in blood flow to the brain. So if we get less blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, we're not going to be able to think more clearly, which is going to make us inherently more depressed and anxious. Some of those inflammatory cytokines can directly activate the limbic system, such as in mast cell activation syndrome and multiple chemical sensitivity syndrome. So I'm sorry I'm talking so fast, but there's multiple different potential mechanisms. And a lot of times it's a little bit of all of the above. It may be more one than the other, but we don't always know that. We're not always able to measure that. The good news is regulating the peripheral nervous system has effects on the central nervous system. And regulating the central nervous system, aka the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, has effects on regulating the peripheral nervous system. So we can kind of enter the castle from a variety of different locations and still affect change with the whole system.
So I'm looking at that as everything you just described fits into one of two camps. A, regulate the nervous system, and we talked about that at a pretty great length. Or B, treat the microbes. And then as you do those collectively, your psychological symptoms such as anxiety, depression, etc., will subside as you are able to address those two things collectively. Is that a fair summary, or no? You think I'm missing some pieces there?
I think that's true. I think I would broaden the kill the microbes to provide the necessary support for cellular physiology. So that would include host immune function. It would include minimizing things that are causing problems like infections and toxins. It would include providing proper nutrients, supporting nerve cell function in the brain. But yes, regulating the nervous system and supporting the physiologic terrain would be another way of putting it. Covers almost the whole gamut of how to heal from chronic Lyme.
So
we only have about 5 minutes left, Dr. Plante, and we haven't really talked about the vagus nerve yet and the gut-brain axis. Can you give us, and I think we're going to need to invite you back because we probably have 2 more hours of conversation we need to engage you in, but can you just give us a quick outline of the importance of gut health and the gut-brain axis?
Yes. So if you're interested in learning more about this topic, I highly recommend the book, The Mind-Gut Connection by Emmer and Mayer. He's a functional gastroenterologist, and I read that book my 3rd year of naturopathic school, and it just blew my mind. But essentially, the microbes in our gut, and really more accurately, the microbes in and on the entirety of the human body, what we collectively refer to as the human microbiome, makes up, it outnumbers every human cell in our body by 10 to 1. And not only that, but the metabolic products, the little molecules that these microbes make, outnumber human cell metabolites in our bloodstream by 100 to 1. So we're like 99% microbial metabolites. And so what these microbes make matters extremely well. It matters more than what they are, actually, but we also care immensely about the species and those kinds of things. And we are just at the beginning of our understanding as a medical community about how to understand the microbiome. But some of those principles, apply to how the immune system develops. So if someone is born C-section rather than vaginally, we now know that affects gut microbiome development. Because instead of being colonized by the mom's vaginal and fecal flora, they're colonized by skin flora and the hospital microbes, which can't be good because we use a lot of antiseptics in the hospital. So think antibiotic resistant microbes. We also have a lower diversity of species in developed countries, especially those born in the hospital, compared to folks living in blue zones or other developing countries where they're going to be exposed to a much bigger variety of microbes. And we know that microbial diversity is an important predictor of overall health as well as resilience of the microbiome. So, okay, we talked about birth, not even, to mention antibiotic use during development when the microbiome is still developing. And then, highly processed foods, genetically modified foods, these things are going to promote more inflammatory species of microbes and more inflammatory metabolites produced by those microbes compared to prebiotic fibers that are present in vegetables and other whole foods that promote anti-inflammatory, gut protective, and immune regulating metabolites from the good microbes in our gut. And this can have implications on not only our immune system's development, but our brain development as well. So lactobacillus, for example, which is a dominant genus of species of probiotic that you will often see in store-bought probiotics, produces GABA. And GABA is a calming neurotransmitter, as well as there's other species that produce serotonin. Like 90% of our serotonin is in our gut. And it was previously thought that antidepressants and other medications affect serotonin and GABA in the brain. And likely they do, but we're now thinking that they affect the function of the vagus nerve and the way that the vagus nerve is communicating between the gut and the brain. So if you have an abundance of species in the microbiome that are producing GABA and serotonin, that's going to then tell the vagus nerve to tell the brain everything's cool. But if there's an imbalance in the microbiome or there's a lot of inflammation in the gut, we see a reduction in serotonin and a reduction in GABA, and the vagus nerve's not sending that, what we call afferent information to the brain. And so there's a lack of regulation there. And if that's happening throughout childhood, for example, in autism or other neurodevelopmental conditions where the gut is heavily impacted, that's going to have massive implications for an autistic individual's ability to emotionally self-regulate because they just don't have the serotonin and the GABA needed. And so there's so much more that I could say about that. And if there's any like kind of last little bits you want me to highlight, I'm happy to do it. But the gut is pretty important.
So I just want to, I mean, first of all, that's fascinating. And we talked about this a couple of years ago when the study came out, but Northeastern, specifically researcher Kim Lewis, did a study and found that chronic Lyme patients have two distinct differences in microbial levels compared to other, we'll call them healthy groups. And they had an abundance of a type of bacteria called Blautia and a suppression of a type of bacteria called bacteroids. And there's been some follow-up work on this, but I think there's a huge connection between the gut microbiome and people that remain unwell from Lyme disease, and they're starting to prove that. Now, why do they have an abundance and a suppression of certain microbes in the gut? I don't think they know yet, but they're identifying these traits that are correlated to chronic Lyme patients, and I think that's going to be a clue to help us identify how to hopefully get them to feel a little bit better as well. So are you familiar with that study, Dr. Plante?
I'm not, and I would love to read more about that. The question is always, are these pathogens also infecting the gut and causing changes in the microbiome that way? Or is it the immune suppression secondary to these infections that allows opportunistic or dysbiotic organisms to overgrow in the gut and develop, into things like SIBO and yeast overgrowth and so on?
So I have one final question. I know we're at 7 o'clock already, but you touched on this, and I think it's really important to discuss because I believe there are so many people that have dementia, Alzheimer's, and Dr. Alan McDonald's research with Lewy body dementia specifically. And I think a lot of them have Lyme disease, and there's studies out there, and I think they can be greatly helped in some cases by getting that recognition and treating and, maybe get some relief from these cognitive decline diseases that exist. So can you just expand upon that a little bit and, talk about the research and the studies and what you know about these conditions that are brain related and how they could be related to Lyme and not necessarily, dementia that is irreversible?
Yeah, so in my experience and in the Amen Clinic's model, the dementia and neurodegenerative conditions are rarely caused by one thing. But I do frequently see Lyme or other vector-borne infections present, along with hormone imbalances, nutritional deficiencies, environmental toxins like mold, blood sugar dysregulation. I forget if it was Dale Bredesen or somebody else that said Alzheimer's is like type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain, where there's insulin resistance there. And so, people are often asking me, is it Lyme causing it, or is it insulin resistance? And it's like, yes, it's all the above. And a dear friend of mine, Dr. Heather Sanderson, is a naturopathic doctor who's trained with Dr. Bredesen, is just coming out with a new book now called Reversing Alzheimer's. And we have a very similar approach where it's like, okay, detox people, address infections, give hormones, especially men with low testosterone, can have a massive effect on cognitive function and dementia. Addressing the microbiome imbalances and supporting that, dealing with heavy metal toxicity, providing nutrients, because oftentimes there's a nutritional deficiency. So I'm not directly answering your question, but it's definitely an important piece of it. For a lot of these patients that are, trying to do all those things at once because time is brain, we may not be able to afford IGeneX or other, advanced tick-borne infection testing. So I'll just do a therapeutic trial of botanicals, Japanese knotweed or biocidin or something like that, while we're doing all those other things. And I haven't had too many cases where we had to do prescription antibiotics because we're addressing all that stuff concurrently. Again, think back to terrain theory. Rather than the germ itself. But I do find that addressing the infection component of that is necessary in a lot of cases.
Dr. Plante, I have to tell you, Rich and I have been excited all week for this interview, and you exceeded our expectations. You are absolutely brilliant. We're going to have to do some follow-ups if you're willing. And we really can't thank you enough for taking time out of your busy day to join our Tick Bootcamp podcast and sharing all this brilliant knowledge with our listeners.
So glad to do it, and would love to be back.